The years between 1860 and 1865 were marked by the most brutal fratricidal conflict American history, perhaps even world history, had ever witnessed. While the Union's navy blue armies and the Confederacy's dusty gray cavalries tore at each other's throats across a deep chasm ranging from slavery to states' rights, the blood of over 600,000 people had already seeped into the soil. On a scorching July day in 1862, the sun was shining directly overhead. What I wouldn't give for a single patch of cloud in the sky, Jack thought as he rode his horse slowly forward. He reached for his water canteen and shook it gently. It was bone dry. His black horse felt the sun's oppressive heat even more intensely, and they had been traveling for nearly 12 days with almost no rest. It wasn't possible for them to hold out much longer like this. They needed water and rest immediately. As he rode across the plains of the Llano Estacado under the burning sun, he spotted a cabin on the horizon. As he drew closer, he noticed a commotion in front of it. He spurred his horse. As the distance closed, the scene became clear. 2 men on horseback held rifles, while 3 more on the ground were trying to restrain a woman. A boy of about 7 or 8 years old was desperately trying to stop them. Jack realized he didn't have much time to think. He pulled his Winchester rifle from its scabbard on the horse's back, took aim while riding at full gallop, and pulled the trigger. When the gunshot rang out, one of the men on horseback was hit. Jack fired again, and by the 3rd shot, the second rider shared his friend's fate. The 3 men on the ground panicked, releasing the woman and the child, and began firing their revolvers. What they didn't know was that hitting a target with a handgun from that distance was nearly impossible. Jack halted his horse, took careful aim, and began firing. All 3 men fell to the ground in quick succession. Jack approached slowly on his horse. There were 6 men lying on the ground. 5 wore the gray jackets of Confederate soldiers, while the 6th, in tattered clothes, was the owner of the cabin. The woman and child were huddled over this man, weeping, when one of the fallen soldiers began to crawl. Jack moved closer and drew his revolver. The man groaned. "Wait, don't do it. I can make you very rich. Please don't kill me." Jack knelt down and grabbed the man by his collar. "You'd better start talking," he said, shaking him roughly. "We're from the Southern Army. About 100 miles to the west, Confederate soldiers are traveling with 2 tons of gold. We kept this information to ourselves and deserted the army to go after it." The man's speech began to falter. Jack knew the man didn't have much time. "How many are they? Tell me now." The man was at his final breath. 25 people, he managed to whisper before he finally passed away. Jack knew there was no need to rush. There was no way they could move a load that heavy very quickly. He called out to the boy crying over his father's body, "Hey, kid, prepare water and feed for my horse." The boy slowly raised his head, looking at the man with tear-filled eyes. He stood up, approached the horse, took the reins, and led it into the small shed next to the house. The woman had stopped crying, trying to gauge whether Jack meant them harm. Jack took the woman by the shoulders and helped her up. "I need a hot meal and some rest. Then I'll be gone," he said in a voice that signaled no ill intent but made it clear his needs must be met. He gestured toward the house. The woman wiped her tears and silently entered. While Jack sat at the table eating, the woman and her son watched him, huddled together. It was clear from the state of the house that they didn't have much food, but the poor woman had piled his plate high as if to show her gratitude. After finishing his meal, Jack lay down on the sofa next to the table and pulled his hat down over his face. "Wake me when the sun sets," he said, falling into a deep sleep. The young boy had prepared the horse and filled the water canteens. As the sun went down, the woman gently nudged Jack's shoulder to wake him. 4 or 5 hours of motionless sleep had rested Jack immensely. He mounted his horse and took 2 of the dead soldiers' horses with him. As he set off toward the west, he had only one dream. He was closer than ever to a treasure that would last him a lifetime. At the head of the column, Captain Harry halted his horse. After carefully scanning the surroundings, he shouted the order to the 50 or so soldiers behind him. "We're setting up camp. We stay here for the night." A man who knew nothing in life but soldiering, Harry was a veteran commander who had clashed with Southerners and Native Americans countless times, winning every time. His only flaw was his disrespectful attitude toward superiors and his refusal to waver from his own convictions. Perhaps that was why he was still serving at the rank of captain. Despite this trait, they had tasked him with transporting the gold to a safe location. Knowing his horse was tired, Jack alternated between the other 2 horses as he traveled. This way, all the horses were minimally fatigued, and Jack could move faster. By dawn, the horses were exhausted, but they had achieved the impossible. They had covered a full 70 miles. As the sun rose, Jack knew he had to rest among the trees where a small stream flowed. After letting the horses drink, he tied them to a tree. After checking the perimeter, he fell asleep under a wide tree, certain it would protect him from the sun. After 2 days on horseback, Jack caught up with the cavalry. He began tracking them from a distance where he couldn't be spotted. When they set up camp that night, he tied his horses to a tree and approached the soldiers on foot. He watched them from a ridge and began counting carefully. "No, this is impossible. It's impossible to do this," he muttered. He had counted exactly 52 soldiers. He quietly returned to his horses. In the silence of the night, he lay down next to them and closed his eyes. Less than 2 hours had passed when he bolted upright and mounted his horse. He began riding south at a full gallop. By sunrise, he had reached the town of Tascosa. He had heard that Southern soldiers had taken control of the town. As soon as he entered, the Southern guards caught his eye. "These are exactly the men I'm looking for," he said to himself. He approached them and dismounted. He moved with heavy steps toward the hitching post by the water trough and tied his horse. The soldiers watched him warily. As Jack's gun glinted in the sunlight, the soldiers' hands moved toward their triggers. He approached them slowly. A black-haired soldier, about 6 feet tall, with a scruffy beard, called out to Jack, "Hey, who are you, and where are you coming from?" After introducing himself, Jack pointed north. "I live in a small house behind the mountains. I came to town for supplies," he replied. He took a few more steps closer, seemingly inspecting the men's jackets. "You're Southern soldiers. I hope you're successful in this war. On my way here, I saw some blue jackets. They seem to be carrying a significant load. Maybe you'd like to tell your commander." After saying this, Jack moved away. He watched them from a distance. First, they spoke among themselves for a moment. Then, the shorter soldier quickly left his post. "There it is," Jack said, "just as I wanted." To avoid drawing attention, he went into the town store and bought some supplies. As he headed back to his horse, he saw about 40 soldiers gathering, preparing to set out. Under their gaze, he loaded his supply bag onto his horse and quietly departed. Once he was a safe distance from town, he picked up the pace. It was clear his mind was racing with thoughts. Now his direction was north. The light was fading. He noticed the glow of a few fires in the distance. He immediately found a place to hide and waited for total darkness before lighting his own fire. He found the most concealed spot among the trees and rocks. He lit a fire and began rummaging through what he'd bought in town. He picked up a large tin can, opened it halfway with his knife, and carefully placed it over the fire. He had always loved canned beans. Using a cloth from his jacket pocket, he took the can off the fire and began to eat. Looking at his horse, he said, "Tomorrow is going to be very tiring, Thunder. We need to rest well tonight," before resting his head on his saddle on the ground and falling asleep. At sunrise, the emergence of flies began to bother Jack, waking him up. He looked at the remains of his beans from the night before. "We'll get to work after a little bite, Thunder," he said, spooning the beans. Jack mounted his horse and moved slowly toward the area where he'd seen the fires the previous night. Although the snapping of dry twigs under the horse's hooves made Jack nervous, he knew he had to press on. At a point where the trees thinned, Jack stopped his horse. He felt something was wrong. His hand slowly moved toward his revolver. Suddenly, about 20 Native Americans burst from the trees. 2 of them held rifles that, though worn, clearly still functioned. The others hemmed Jack in with bows and spears. He knew he couldn't survive if he went for his gun. He didn't have enough bullets for all of them. He slowly raised his hands. When they reached the camp, they took Jack to the largest tent and made him kneel. He was now a bound prisoner. Facing him sat the tribal chief, with his eldest son beside him. In broken English, the chief looked Jack in the eye and asked what he was doing on tribal lands. Jack knew very well that if he said something the chief didn't like, he'd be skinned alive. To ensure the chief understood, he spoke in the calmest, slowest manner. "Soldiers." The chief's son's eyes lit up. He stood up in a rage, holding a large knife to Jack's hair, about to slit his throat. He leaned in close. "Where are they?" Jack could feel the sharpness of the blade against his throat. "Palo Duro. They will pass through Palo Duro Canyon to Fort Union. They'll reach the fort tomorrow evening." The chief stood and took his son's hand. "Take half our men to the canyon immediately and set an ambush." Then he turned to Jack. "If you are lying, we will tear you apart," he said, ordering 2 men to take Jack away. As Lone Eagle, the chief's son, mounted up with his men, Jack watched them from where he was tied to a post. The horses thundered through the tents and were gone. Once everyone had returned to their tents, Jack checked his surroundings. He was sure no one was watching him. He began to move his wrist slowly. He was trying to reach a small pocket knife he had tied to his wrist under his shirt. Finally, he succeeded. He cut the ropes with the knife. Before standing up, he checked the area one last time, then moved slowly toward his horse. He knew if he mounted and galloped away right there, they would chase him. They moved away from the tents with small, quiet steps. Jack knew he had lost a lot of time. Once on his horse, he rode hard toward the canyon. Toward noon the next day, the Union soldiers reached the canyon. Captain Harry chose 15 of his men and ordered them to stay behind as rear guards. Just as they reached the midpoint of the canyon, the shooting started. Union soldiers were falling from their horses one by one. The captain and the survivors took cover among the rocks, recovering from the initial shock. The Southern soldiers were firing like rain. While the Southerners were firing and closing in, they were suddenly targeted by the 15 Union soldiers who had circled behind them. Both sides had lost many men. Just as the gunfire died down for a moment, arrows began raining from the sky. Suddenly, Native Americans were charging from the cliffs above. Hearing the sounds of battle, Jack spurred his horse even faster. He knew he had to involve himself in this fight, or the outcome might not be what he wanted. As he neared the combat zone, he jumped off his horse and grabbed his Winchester. Advancing while taking cover among massive boulders, he saw the Union and Confederate soldiers had stopped fighting each other and were focusing all their fire on the Native Americans. The tribal warriors had very few rifles. The rest were trying to join the fight with arrows. As the sounds of bullets and arrows echoed through the valley, Half the warriors lay motionless on the ground. Jack began firing from his cover. His only targets were the gray and blue jackets. He dropped a soldier with nearly every shot. Thanks to Jack, the tide of the battle seemed to be turning, but then something unexpected happened. Only 6 or 7 Native Americans were left, and they were retreating. Watching them flee, Jack whispered, "No, not now." Now he was left with the 2 groups of soldiers, 11 Southerners and 6 Union men. Jack had picked off 4 more Southern soldiers before he began checking his ammunition behind a rock. Seeing he had only 9 rounds left for his rifle, he cursed himself for not buying more bullets in town. It was impossible to see more soldiers from his current cover. To change positions, he dashed toward a rock 30 feet away. Bullets rained down on him from both sides. Just as he dove behind the rock, he felt a sharp pain. He was safe behind the boulder now, but he had taken a bullet to his left leg. He took off his belt, wrapped it around his leg, and tightened it hard. He stood up and continued firing. With his final rifle rounds, he hit 4 more Southerners and 5 more Union men. He slowly set aside his empty rifle. As he drew his revolver, he knew firing from this distance would be a waste of lead. He slowly rose and peeked out to check the area. He didn't know how many soldiers were left, but it was quiet. Clearly, the others were also low on ammo and wanted to spend it carefully. Jack made another move, getting even closer to the center of the skirmish. At that moment, the last Union soldier jumped up and was shot straight through the heart by the Southern captain, Harry. The sun was about to set. Jack wanted to finish this before dark. He picked up a rock and threw it forward. He immediately shot the 2 Southern soldiers who tried to return fire. Captain Harry was alone. "I am Captain Harry. I reckon it's just you and me left. I've got 1 bullet. If you're willing, I'll come out to duel before the sun goes down." Jack listened in silence. He holstered his gun and stepped out with heavy strides. "I'm waiting for you," Jack called out. The captain kept his word. He stood 15 yards away, directly facing Jack, his gun at his hip. Jack and Harry locked eyes, hands hovering over their holsters, fingers spread. It was obvious both were masters of the draw. The moment Harry went for his gun, a single shot echoed through the valley. As Harry fell to his knees, Jack was already reholstering his weapon. The last thing Harry saw as he slumped to the earth was Jack's face approaching him, and then his eyes closed. Jack knew hiding the gold-laden wagon in one of the hundreds of caves in the canyon would be the best idea. He knew better than to travel alone with that much gold. He took the wagon to the deepest point of a cave he'd scouted. He unhitched the horses and gave them a hard slap on the haunches to send them on their way. He took out his rifle and shot the wooden wheels of the wagon, making the gold-filled carriage immovable. As Jack emerged from the cave on his horse, carrying 2 bags with 20 pounds of gold each, he slowly moved off and disappeared into the dark valley. 2 days later, when Jack arrived back at the place where the story began, there were no bodies left. The woman and her young son had buried her husband and the other soldiers a short distance from the house. As soon as the woman and her son saw Jack, fear gripped them. He had saved their lives last time, but what about now? When Jack reached them, he tossed one of the bags from his horse toward them. Gold bullion spilled out of the bag and onto the dirt. Without a word, Jack turned his horse, gave it a light nudge with his spurs, and after a while he was gone from sight.